A lot of contract reviews are slower than they need to be for one simple reason. People do not separate real legal red flags from drafting friction that looks serious but is not actually material. And when that distinction is missing, two things happen. First, legal loses time on points that do not change the actual risk profile of the deal. Second, business teams stop trusting legal judgment because everything starts sounding equally urgent. That is a problem, because in a real SaaS negotiation, not every issue deserves the same level of attention, escalation, or pushback. So in this video, I want to explain a practical question. What is a red flag that actually matters, and what is a red flag that only wastes time if you overfight it? My view is simple. A real red flag is not just a clause you do not like. A real red flag is a contractual point that can create one of the following outcomes: material financial exposure, operational commitments the business cannot actually perform, regulatory or compliance exposure, structural loss of control over claims, data, or service obligations, or a bad precedent that will be difficult to contain across future deals. If the clause does not do one of those things, then maybe it is not a real red flag. Maybe it is just a drafting preference. And business lawyers need to know the difference. 1. What a real red flag looks like. Let me start with the issues that usually matter. First category, liability that it is disproportionate to the economics of the deal. If the contract creates a liability exposure that is clearly out of proportion with the contract value, that matters. Examples: unlimited liability in a standard SaaS deal, a cap that is far above internal policy without real justification, indemnities drafted so broadly that they bypass the agreed cap in practice, or refund mechanisms that function as hidden damages. That is not cosmetic drafting. That is core risk allocation. Second category, obligation that the company cannot actually perform. This is one of the most important categories, and it is often underestimated. A clause is a real red flag when it commits the company to something legal has no right to promise on its own. Examples: security obligations that are not validated by the security team, uptime or performance language that product or engineering would not stand behind, audit rights that operation cannot support, notification deadlines that are unrealistic in an actual incident, or deletion, return, or migration obligation that the product does not operationalize cleanly. A business lawyer should always ask, who is going to perform this obligation in real life? If the answer is vague, the risk is probably real. Third category, data, security, and compliance commitments with unclear scope. Another red flag is when the contract includes compliance language that sounds reasonable at a high level but becomes dangerous when you read the scope carefully. Examples: promises of full compliance with all laws without limitation, vague commitments to industry standard security without a defined baseline, data protection language that reallocates responsibilities incorrectly, or contractual security representation that exceed actual internal controls. The issue is not that compliance matters too much. The issue is that overbroad compliance language can create liability the business did not consciously accept. Fourth category, loss of control over claims or dispute posture. Some clauses matter because they shift control. Examples: indemnity language where the other side effectively controls defense strategy. Audit clauses with no procedural limits. Suspension or termination provisions that can be triggered too easily. Or customer paper that allows broad unilateral remedies. These points matter because they change power, not just wording. Fifth category, precedent-setting concessions. Some issues are red flags not because the single deal is catastrophic, but because the concession is likely to spread. For example, agreeing to a non-standard uncapped security position for a template deal type. Accepting unusual procurement terms that sale will try to reuse. Or creating a fallback wording that later becomes the internal precedent. A business lawyer should not look only at the single negotiation. They should also ask, if we give this away here, are we going to see it in 5 more deals next quarter? That is how portfolio thinking enters contract review. 2. What usually wastes time? Now let's go to the other side. What are the issues that often consume far too much time compared to the real importance? First category, non-material wording preferences. Sometimes legal teams spend too much time rewriting language that is not actually changing the allocation of risk. Examples: stylistic preferences in boilerplate language, small wording changes where both versions are functionally equivalent, or over-editing definitions that do not affect the commercial or legal structure of the clause. This kind of work may feel tedious, but it often does not move the deal in a meaningful way. Second category, low-impact process language. Not every procedural point deserves escalation. Examples: minor notice mechanics that do not affect actual enforcement. Formatting issues in order of precedence language where the practical hierarchy is already clear enough. Or drafting points that are technically imperfect but not materially dangerous in context. This does not mean process language never matters. It means not every process point is a real blocker. Third category, issues that look bad only in the abstract. This is a very common mistake. Some clauses look uncomfortable when read in isolation, but the real risk becomes low once you consider the full contract structure. For example, a sentence that looks broad, but it's effectively limited elsewhere by the cap, the remedy structure, or the scope definition. Language that looks aggressive, but sits in a low-value contract with limited operational dependency. Or customer comments that sound alarming, but do not survive once the deal structure is analyzed as a whole. Here, a strong contract review is never clause by clause in a vacuum. It is always structural. 3. The triage method I would actually use. So, how do you sort issues quickly and intelligently? I would use a 5-question test. Question 1. What is the exact risk? Not the vague concern, the exact risk. It is money, operations, compliance, control, precedent, or timing. If you cannot identify the real risk precisely, then you probably should not be escalating yet. Question 2. Who would absorb the problem internally? Would the impact sit with legal, finance, security, product, customer success, support, leadership? This question is extremely useful because many contract red flags become obvious only once you identify the internal owner of the pain. Question 3. Does this point create real downside or just drive team discomfort? That distinction matters. A lot of negotiation noise comes from confusing bad drafting aesthetics with material downside. Question 4. Can we actually perform what we are being asked to sign? This is one of the best filters in commercial contracting. If performance depends on people, systems, workflows, or controls that do not exist, then the issue is likely real. Question 5. If we concede this, will it matter beyond this deal? That is the precedent question. If the answer is yes, the issue may deserve more attention even if the single deal looks manageable. 4. Concrete examples. Let me make this more practical. Example 1. Customer asks for a 24-hour security incident notification deadline. Does this matter? Yes, potentially a lot. Why? Because the issue is not only legal, it is operational. Can the business actually investigate, classify, validate, and report a relevant incident within that window on a reliable basis? If not, then the clause creates execution risk and potential breach risk. That is a real red flag. Example 2. Customer wants minor wording changes to the general notice clause. Does this matter? Usually not much, unless the changes affect enforceability in a meaningful way. In many cases, this is not where the legal team should spend its negotiation capital. Example 3. Customer requests unlimited liability for confidentiality, privacy, and security combined. Does this matter? Yes, very clearly. Why? Because this is not a drafting detail. This is a major exposure issue with real financial and precedent implications. Example 4. Customer changes a definition in a way that does not affect pricing, remedies, scope, or ownership. Does this matter? Maybe not. You still review it, but you do not automatically treat it like a top-tier red flag. Last example. Customer requests an audit right with broad access language and no frequency limits. Does this matter? Yes, obviously. Why? Because it can create operational burden, confidentiality issues, and loss of control. That is not just paperwork. That is leverage and process risk. So, 5. What good legal judgment looks like. Good legal judgment in a SaaS contract is not about raising the highest number of comments. It is about ranking the issues properly. It is about knowing what needs pushback, what needs internal escalation, what can be traded, what can be cleaned up quickly, and what is simply not worth slowing down the deal. That is what makes legal useful in a commercial environment, because a business lawyer is not there to prove that every clause could be improved. A business lawyer is there to improve the quality of decision making under deal pressure. That means identifying the points that really affect exposure, execution, compliance, leverage, and repeatability. Everything else should be handled with proportion. So, if I had to summarize the whole video in one line, it would be this. A real contract red flag is not a clause that looks imperfect. It is a clause that creates material downside, unperformable obligations, loss of control, or dangerous precedent. That is the distinction legal teams need to make faster and more consistently. Because once you know what actually matters, contract review becomes sharper, faster, and much more useful to the business.